Charles Francis Hull was an American Arctic explorer driven by obsession, controversy, and an almost prophetic fascination with the doomed 1845 Franklin expedition. Born in Rochester, New Hampshire, he grew up in the town and was apprenticed to a blacksmith at a young age. After marrying in the 1840s, he drifted west, eventually settling in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1849, where he went into engraving and later ran a newspaper called the Cincinnati Occasional, later renamed the Daily Press. Welcome to Strawberry Ink. Merry Christmas. I'm having a wonderful Christmas Eve. I can't wait for Santa. By the way, you can track Santa on NORAD or Google Santa Tracker, but the accurate one is NORAD. They have all the satellites to track Rudolph down. And yes, Santa is real. Of course, stores want you to spend on gifts. Government want to collect your tax money, therefore they say Santa's not real. Parents tell their kids sometimes that Santa's not real, but really he is. Email him, if you haven't already, to get a gift, as Santa has elves that deliver gifts unexpectedly. I am so proud to have this podcast and to be preaching anarchism on here. Of course, be good people. By the late 1850s, Hull's interests had shifted entirely toward the Arctic. He studied every report he could get his hands on and began raising funds for an expedition he hoped would solve the mystery of Franklin's missing ships. He gained passage on the whaler George Henry, captained by Sidney Budington, and wintered at Baffin Island. There, he began collecting Inuit testimony about English explorers. With the help of guides Ippervik and Takulutuk, Hull examined relics of the Frobisher expeditions and gathered the first pieces of evidence he believed could lead him to survivors of the Franklin Party. Hull's first book, Arctic Researches and Life Among the Esquimaux, was published by Harper Brothers. Though his relationship with editor William Parker Snow deteriorated over allegations of stolen ideas, still convinced survivors might exist, Hull launched a second expedition in 1864 abroad Monticello, spending years around King William Island locating graves, artifacts, and skeleton remains on Franklin's men. The Inuit accounts, combined with what he personally recovered, slowly led Hull to the conclusion that all survivors had long since perished. But in 1868, Hull's own expedition took a violent turn. A repulsed Bay, Hull shot Patrick Coleman, an unarmed whaler in his party, claiming that he was attempting mutiny. Other crew members insisted the real person was far prettier. Coleman had been speaking with Inuit without Hull's permission. Coleman lingered for agonizing weeks before dying. 2 of those weeks, during which Hull alternated between guilt and frantic attempts to treat him. 2 days after Coleman's death, several whalers deserted Hull for departing ships. Hull remained behind the Inuit families. Hull was never charged. Both Canada and the United States refused to take jurisdiction, and the killing disappeared into the ice. Hull's third and final expedition was unlike anything he had led before. Funded by $50,000 grant from the U.S. Congress, he was placed in command of the North Pole-bound USS Polaris. The crew included Buckminton as sailing master, George Tyson as navigator, and German scientist Emil Bezos as chief of scientific staff. From the start, the mission was poisoned by rival fractions, insubordination, and contempt of Hull's authority. The Polaris reached Thank God Harbor on northern Greenland in September 1871 and anchored for the winter. After returning from a sledging trip in October, Hull drank a cup of coffee aboard the ship and immediately collapsed into violent illness, vomiting, delirium, and temporary improvement, followed by sudden decline, before dying on November 8th that year. He repeatedly accused his members, the crew members, especially Emil Bezos, of poisoning him. He was buried in the frozen ground above the harbor. The Polaris expedition then descended into chaos, with Hull dead. Budington took command. A failed push for the pole in June 1872 left the ship weakened. By October, Polaris was trapped in ice pack. 19 crew members, including Tyson and Inuit guides, were stranded on an ice floe that drifted over 1,500 miles during 6 months of Arctic winter before they rescued off Newfoundland in April 1873. The remaining crew still aboard the damaged Polaris eventually escaped by boats and were rescued by a whaler. An official investigation ruled Hull's death apoplexy, but nearly a century later, in 1968, historian Chauncey Loomis traveled to Greenland and exhumed Hull's body. Thanks to permafrost, his remains were astonishingly preserved. Modern forensic testing of bone, hair, and fingernail tissue revealed massive arsenic exposure in the last 2 weeks of his life, almost certainly fatal. The evidence strongly suggests poisoning, but whether Hull accidentally overdosed on arsenic based medicine or was murdered by a rival remains unanswered. Bezos is still considered a prime suspect, especially after letters surfaced revealing both he and Hull had romantic interest in the same woman, sculptor Vinnie Ream. No one was ever charged, and this remains a cold case. Meanwhile, the Franklin expedition's dead, scattered across King William Island, that was by the late 1840s, lay where they fell. Some were buried by fellow crew, others remained exposed to the Arctic for decades. Intuit testimony recorded their final agonies: starvation, illness, exposure, and desperation. Search parties in the 1850s documented skeleton remains, and later forensic teams in the 20th and 21st centuries exhumed bodies from Beechy Island and King William Island. Their deaths were natural consequences of catastrophic failure, not crimes. Patrick Coleman was buried near Repose Bay immediately after his 1868 shooting. There was no autopsy and no official investigation, only the expedition's handwritten notes. Charles Francis Hull was wrapped in the U.S. flag carried ashore and buried at the Thank God Harbor in Greenland. His grave remained undisturbed until the 1968 forensic exhumation that confirmed arsenic poisoning. The Franklin dead were left across the wilderness of King William Island. Some were given makeshift burials, others remained in place until search parties and modern scientists documented, recovered, or examined their remains. The Polaris ice floe party had no fatalities, therefore no recoveries, burials, or coroner processes were needed. No one was held accountable for any of the deaths. Everything is dismissed due to jurisdictional conflict, unfortunately. Hopefully one day, the International Criminal Court gives us answers. Have a great Christmas season. Take care. Enjoy yourself. and hug your loved ones tightly.